And now you listen to me again. If it's worth saying, it's worth saying again. As we say in our reading group, the old jokes are the best jokes. But what I'm going to talk about isn't funny at all. I'm going to talk about health inequity. But I do it from a position of optimism and hope. I don't do it from a position of depression. Oh, it's all ghastly, it's all going to hell. And particularly, as some of you heard me say last evening at the dinner, coming to the Nordic countries fuels that optimism, not because you've solved the problems, but because you're grappling with the problems. You've got good health and relatively narrow health inequalities, and you're saying this is not good enough, there's much more to do. So both recognizing the issue and grappling with it is inspiring. Now, one of these things will work. That one does. Great. As you just heard, and as I'm sure you know, I chaired the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health. I've just come from a meeting with the Minister and Susanne Jakob, and I said to the Minister, I applaud what he said, but I'm going to go further. He talked about mastery, and I said to the Minister, mastery and control over your life follows the social gradient. Simply telling people to go for a walk, to reconnect with nature and with their inner being, doesn't work. We know that that follows the social gradient, people's ability to take control over their lives. And I said to him, I'm not party political. Last time I was in Sweden, somebody from the public, the Swedish National Institute, said to me, the word in Sweden is you've become much more political. I said, me? Political? No, political. I just report the facts, the evidence. There are political implications of the evidence. And my review, as I said to the Minister, my review in England, the Marmot review, was commissioned by a Labour government. And I went to talk to the shadow ministers from the Conservative government because it was predictable that they would win the next election. And one of the things I talked about was people taking control over their lives. And as I said to the Minister, now that's a key Conservative position, individual freedom. But that is distributed across the social gradient. You can't take control of your life if you're poor. You can't take control of your life if you don't have the income to buy healthy food. You can't take control of your life if you can't afford to feed your children. You can't take control of your life if the education system is failing you. We have to create the conditions for people to take control over their lives. I was asked this week, do you see that the idea of health being a matter of personal responsibility is a direct threat to approaches to social determinants of health? And my approach to that is an empirical one. Simply arguing that health is a matter of personal responsibility, therefore the government or civil society has no role here, is empirically shown not to work. Simply saying it's up to you actually makes health inequalities worse. That's what the evidence shows. So that I don't start from a preconceived political position of what fits with a political philosophy. I start with the evidence of what works. And saying health is up to you doesn't work. A second thing the Minister said, and we talked about this just now, about working with industry. And I think the initiative that he discussed this morning that the Norwegian government is taking with the food industry to get reduction in salt content is wonderful, terrific, and I applaud it. It's great. Now, when we were doing the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, you notice I'm departing from my speech, but you'll forgive me. I'll just take 2 hours instead of 1 hour. You know. Well, I wanted to show slides last night at dinner, but they said no slides, so had to make it short. When we were involved with the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, people said, you've got to work with industry. Well, great idea. I was looking at figures published by the Coca-Cola Corporation. The average number of servings, 8 fluid ounces, they work in, that's about 250 mils. The mean number of Coca-Cola servings per person per year in Mexico is 675. I'm not good at sums, but that's nearly 2 a day. And presumably the children, well, maybe not, in the first year of life don't have, maybe they do have Coca-Cola. And I'm sure it's an accident that Mexico has the highest obesity levels in the world. I was telling colleagues that I have a nightmare. Let me tell you about my nightmare. You know, I only use slides. Let me tell you about my nightmare. My nightmare is that I was attending a board meeting of a soft drink company. And the technical, that's a nightmare, I can tell you. And the technical director is addressing the board and he says, gentlemen, it's my nightmare, they're all men, no women in this. In your nightmare, you can have women. But mine, he says, gentlemen, he says, we're in trouble. We're in the business of selling calories, flavored, sugary water with bubbles in it. That's what we sell. And the global population are doing less physical activity, so they need fewer calories. So our private jet planes will fly away without us as we sell fewer calories, and Great Depression in the board. But, he said, I have a solution. There are 2 drivers of how many calories people need a day to stay in balance. One is how much physical activity they do, and the other is their body mass. Overweight people need more calories to stay in balance than people of normal body mass. So we'll make people fat. How do you do that? You increase portion size. Doesn't cost anything. All the cost is in promotion, distribution, and packaging. We'll give people more for free. We'll make them fat. And they say, wonderful, we'll get our private jet planes back. And I wake up from this nightmare screaming and thinking, thank goodness normal life is nothing like that. So yes, of course we need to collaborate with industry, but industry's number 1 goal is profit. That's what they do. That's why they exist. If an industry tells you about corporate social responsibility and you believe them, then I have no sympathy for you. That isn't what they do. So we are on a collision course. So an initiative to get salt reduction is great, and that's potentially achievable. An initiative to get the purveyors of sugary water to sell less sugary water directly threatens what they do. And as you know well, it's the same issue with tobacco. We are on a collision course. We have different goals, so collaborating is difficult. In the wake of the Global Commission, we did the English review, which called Fair Society, Healthy Lives. I did something really odd. I was talking to opening session of the American Public Health Association. 7,000 people in the room. And when I say really odd, I behaved as if I was having a private conversation, which is really pretty odd. You know, there's 7,000 people. And I said that I was a bit regretful that I had given my English review the title Fair Society, Healthy Lives, because the government in Britain was using the word fairness as if it had no meaning at all. They cut the top rate of tax and they called it fair. They cut tax credits, tax reduction to the poor, so it made them worse off, and they called it fair. They cut services to the disadvantaged, and they call it fair. I call it a grotesque parody of fairness. Now, I said all that thinking I was having a private conversation. And in next week's British Medical Journal, there's a blog saying Michael Marmot to 7,000 people criticised the government's policies as a grotesque parody of fairness. Well, I think we should use language the way we think it conveys something. I use health equity in a technical sense. That systematic inequalities in health between social groups that are judged to be avoidable by reasonable means are unfair. Therefore, this is the health in all policies, health equity in all policies approach. Therefore, any policies that retard progress towards reduction of these avoidable health inequalities are unfair. So, fairness is not, should not be a label that you apply retrospectively to whatever policy you're going to do for some other reason. This is really, really naive. But being honest seems to me a reasonable standard to have in public life. This is really naive. You can tell that I haven't been out there very long. But actually saying, this is what I believe in, and this is what I'm going to do because what I believe in, it seems to me absolutely fine. I have friends from all parts of the political spectrum, and conservatives, left-wing, centre, and we have perfectly reasonable conversations because people have beliefs. And that's fine to have different beliefs. But don't have one set of beliefs and dress it up as if it's some other set of beliefs. Do what you do. You heard from Susanna, and I'm delighted that we can share a platform again. I enjoy it every time we do. You heard from Susanna about the European review, and we did a similar review for the European Commission. These were the 6 domains of recommendations from my English review. And I'll talk more about the European review in a moment. And again, we talked to the minister this morning about starting at the beginning of life. Give every child the best start in life, education and lifelong learning, employment and working conditions. Interestingly, in Britain, my review of health inequalities was commissioned by a Labour government. Then the government changed, and we have a Conservative-led coalition government, and the question was, what would happen? The government, the Conservative-led coalition government, issued a public health white paper and said, this is the government's response to Sir Michael Marmot's review. We have to put reduction of health inequalities at the centre of our public health strategy, and we will not achieve this through the health system alone. Wow, that was really good. And I met our Secretary of State for Health, our Senior Health Minister. Just parenthetically, we have a Senior Health Minister and a Public Health Minister. I counted up the other day, the first Public Health Minister was 1997 under the Labour government. In the last 17 years, we've had 11 Public Health Ministers. And I briefed every one of them. And they all start by saying, oh, I don't want to be seen as the nanny state and telling people to behave better and so on. And I explain they won't listen to you anyway. It doesn't matter what you say. You can tell people whatever you like and it makes no difference. You've got to address the social determinants. They say, wow, really? And we go through all this. And then they get moved. You just get started and they get moved. 11. I don't know whether talking to me means they get reshuffled. But the government did take on, and when I met the Secretary of State for Health, I said, I made 6 recommendations and you picked up 5 in your public health white paper, which is great. So which one did we miss out? Minimum income for healthy living. I said, in a rich society, everybody should have the minimum necessary for a healthy life, and your policies are making that more difficult. I talked the language of moral responsibility. I said that we do have to draw on the evidence, and I don't start from party politics, but I do start from a position that avoidable health inequalities are wrong. And part of our goal should be putting them right. Susanna put up a slide with some quotes from the Helsinki collaboration, and one of them that I really doubted said, we economists got it wrong. I've never heard an economist say that. They have got it wrong catastrophically, but I've never heard an economist say, we economists got it wrong. But it's been put to me that we should be making the economic case. I make the moral case. Given that I've been indulging, let me talk about this one. This comes from our European review, and it looks at life expectancy at age 25 by education. So men first. And you can see SE is Sweden. There's a rumor going around Europe that there's a Swedish paradox, that Sweden's doing everything right, quote unquote, but still has large health inequalities. That isn't what this slide seems to look like, really. If you look at Sweden and Norway, I think you see 2 things. One, they have very good life expectancy at age 25, this is men, and the gap between those with high and low education is small. In fact, if you look across countries, so Estonia and Hungary at one end, and Sweden, Italy, and Norway at the other, if you look across countries, there's much bigger variation for people with low education. The variation's much less for people with high education. Sorry, the ISCED is education, 0 to 2 is the lowest level, and 5 to 6 is tertiary education. So the variation between countries is much less for people with high education. It means that in Hungary and Estonia, they do know how to achieve good health. They do it for people with high education. I imagined a conversation between a parent in Hungary, I'm not looking at Susanna, a parent in Hungary and her child. And the parent says to the child, you've got to study hard so you can have a long life. The child said, I'm a child. Why do I care about a long life? I want to sniff the flowers and gladden my heart and nourish my soul. Why would I care about a long life? And you say, well, a long life, because we think life expectancy reflects what's going on in society, a long life is actually an indicator of a good life. So it's not that you should care about the extra year of life, but it's a reflection that a lot of other things have done well for you. Says the child. Well, okay, if I accept that a long life is a reflection of a good life, if you think that's so important, why didn't you arrange for me to be born in Sweden? Why on earth did you arrange for me to be born in Hungary? And you say, shut up and eat your green vegetables. The child says, pulling rank is the last refuge of a scoundrel. This is a very sophisticated child. Pulling rank is the last refuge of a scoundrel. What you say to your child, okay, what the evidence shows is if you have high education, you can redress the disadvantage of being born in Hungary. Ah, says the child, you mean if I go to university, it's like traveling across the Baltic. It gets me while staying right here in Hungary. You say you're halfway there already. So what we think we know, and you explain to your child, so the child's still a bit mystified. Why is it that being good at grammar should get me higher life expectancy in Hungary, but being good at grammar doesn't make much difference in Sweden? This is a very argumentative child. And you say to your child, well, I think education is important. Being good at grammar gets you a better job and so on. I think education is important everywhere. That's why people with more education in Sweden have longer life expectancy than people with short education in Sweden. But in addition, education empowers you, gives you control over your life, gives you better conditions. And in Sweden, in Norway, the differences in living conditions between those with more and less education are much less than they are in Hungary and Estonia. If you're in Hungary and Estonia, what we want is to improve the conditions for everybody. Not just have some with education who'll get the better and leave others behind. So education has these two very important functions. And when I said to the minister, talking about empowerment, that's the route to empowerment. And it starts not with what happens in the schools. Well, as Susanna said to him, it starts preconception. And then, as I'll say in a moment, investment in early child development. And we see the same thing for women. I need to make a move on, aren't I? Because I'm indulging myself and we'll run out of time and the organizer will drag me off the stage. We did a survey on what countries have been doing on social determinants and health inequalities. And we've got 3 clusters of countries. The green are those that have been pretty active. The orange are those with we were being kind, a variable response. And that orange one in between Norway and Finland, my geography's not very good, but a variable response. And in fact, we repeated the survey and that variable slipped down a bit, that Sweden, which had been a big leader, was actually slipping a bit on its policies and social determinants. And some of the other things we look at suggest that Sweden was slipping a bit compared with other Nordic countries. I tell you, I'm not political. I just report the facts, but that's what it showed. And then the third cluster was, we're being kind, relatively underdeveloped. In other words, they're doing bugger all. The values and principles of the European Review are social justice. We borrowed from the Sustainable Development people the idea of intergenerational equity, and I'll say a word about that. Human rights, life course approach, looking at vulnerability and exclusionary processes, as well as hazards, empowerment that I've talked about. And you saw this from Susanna. Let's talk about the early years. Of course, early years services are vital, but so is the context. This looks at child poverty, where poverty is defined as less than 60% median income, before and after taxes and transfers. So if you look at Latvia, before taxes and transfers, child poverty is about 35%, and in Sweden, it's about 32%. After taxes and transfers, child poverty is still 25% in Latvia, and in Sweden it's 12%. In Slovenia it's even lower. It's a choice. It's a political choice. What do you want child poverty to be? I said a few minutes ago that I was addressing the American Public Health Association meeting, and I showed them this slide. Then I showed them another slide. The child poverty levels in the United States are higher than in Latvia. And I looked at these 7,000 people and I said, you live in a democracy. This must be the level of child poverty that you want. Otherwise, you would vote a government that did something different. The president of the Institute of Medicine came up to me afterwards. He said, "Do you think you'll be invited back?" Well, it is a political choice. I reviewed Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, for The Lancet. After you've listened to Desert Island Discs, then you can read my review of Piketty in The Lancet. And Piketty is, you no doubt, you've been living in a cave if you haven't read news reports of what he's talking about, that he's particularly concerned with increased inequalities, not just of income, but of wealth. He's concerned that in the 19th century, particularly in Europe, in France, in Britain, that we had wealth-based inequalities that were huge. They went down in the 20th century. We had 2 world wars and a Great Depression. They went down. Oh, don't leave yet. I'm just getting to the point. They went down in the 20th century with these 2 world wars and global depression, but they're rising again. And Piketty says it's clear that the level of inequality that we tolerate is a political choice. If we want to increase inequalities in wealth, what we should do is transfer assets from the public sector to the private sector. We should allow or engineer the economy so we can have runaway incomes at the top and slow income growth for everybody else. We should reduce taxes on capital, which is corporation tax, capital gains tax, and inheritance tax. And then we'll happily have a situation of increasing inequalities in wealth and income. Well, in Britain and other parts of the world, that's what we're doing. It's almost as if we're reading Piketty and saying, this is the choice we're going to make. We're going to increase inequalities of wealth and income. It is a political choice. It's not a fundamental law of economics that this should happen. It's not given by God or Darwin, whoever you believe in. It is a political choice. Oops, I didn't want to get that far. You notice I'm trying to make up for some of the extra things. Working conditions. I had an interesting experience. There was a BBC Panorama program where a worker had filmed undercover in the warehouse of a large distribution, and you click on your on your web and you order a book. I won't mention the name of the company, but it sells books and it's been in the news a lot. CDs, pays no tax in Britain at all. No tax at all. It's based in Luxembourg or the Virgin Islands or somewhere. So it sells billions but doesn't pay any tax at all. And this poor benighted individual who worked in the distribution company in this vast warehouse, when he was on night shift, he worked for 9.5 hours with 1 half-hour break and 2 15-minute breaks. And it was almost as if his employer had read the literature on psychosocial factors and work and injected them, all the factors, into a big syringe and injected him with low control, effort-reward imbalance, organizational injustice. So the way this thing works, if you don't know, he goes to work at whatever time, 8 o'clock in the evening on the night shift. He goes to work and he gets an electronic gizmo. And he looks at this thing and the thing says, go to row P, shelf 3, and get an item, put it in your trolley. And then it then says, go to row X, shelf 2, get another item, put it in your trolley. Does that till he's got 150 kilograms in his trolley. He pushes it to the packers. They take it out. They stick a label. Back and it goes. It's terrific. You sit at home, you click. He picks, she packs, sticks, and 2 days later you got it. It's fantastic, fantastic. Then he empties his trolley, and then the gizmo takes him back again. For lighter items, he had to do 120 items an hour to a minute. For heavier items, it's a bit slower than that. I said, did you ever do it? Not once. Not once. Can you imagine you go to work, just think about your own work situation, and not once in your whole working life did you ever feel you got to the end of the day and said, I did it. I did it. Whether it was sending the email, preparing the brief for the minister, finishing the report, or whatever it is that you had to do. Not once in your whole working life do you ever feel, I did it. I finished. Sense of achievement. And it's worse than that because they're checking and they're saying, oh, you only did 85. 3 more like that and you get a penalty point. Get enough penalty points and you're out. I said, did you talk to fellow workers about all this? Talk to anybody. Who's got time to talk to anybody? 120 an hour. I can't talk to anybody. So there's no social supports, no collegiality, no trade union. The warehouse is the size of, God, I don't know how big it is. It's vast. So he's got a half-hour break to have a meal. It takes 15 minutes to get from one end of the warehouse to the cafeteria. Who's got time to talk to anybody else? So, effort-reward imbalance, high demand, low control, organizational injustice, shift work, heavy lifting, all check, all the things we know increase illness in the workplace, he's subjected to. Is this the future of work? And I feel so guilty. If I want to buy a book, am I going to go to this online retailer? But I can't find the book in my local bookshop because they've killed off the local bookshops. Is this the future of work? So let me skip this. You know unemployment's bad for health. Let me talk about older age. We think older age is vital and healthy aging. As Woody Allen says, what's the point of living to 100 if you've got to give up all the things that make it enjoyable to live to 100? So if you had to behave sensibly and so on. Woody Allen doesn't think that's such a good thing to do. But most of us think that being healthy, well-being, as the minister said, is vital. These, of course, are distributed most unequally. This is from the Whitehall 2 study of civil servants, looking at the top graph is a physical health score, high grades, middle grades, and low grades. Regrettably, we all decline with age, high, middle, and low. But the high grades reach the same level about 15 years later than the low grades. The mental health improves. I guess as we get older, we just can't figure out what's going on anymore, so we feel better about the world. But mental health improves, but more rapidly for the high grades than for the low grades. So being high grade is the equivalent to being about 15 years younger. And in our English longitudinal study of aging, ELSA, we found the same thing that we found in Whitehall 2. People in professional and managerial classes, occupations, reach the same level of disability as those in the routine and basic about 15 years later. Now, this is life course, but do we say to today's older people, well, too late, sorry, should have had a healthier life till now, not much we can do about you, you're on the scrap heap. Well, we don't actually think that's right. We know, for example, that poverty is bad for older people, and it's a political choice. Am I making a point here? This is looking at poverty in older people and the rest of the population. So the straight line means that the poverty levels in old age is the same as in the rest of the population. So some countries have decided that old age poverty should be higher than the rest. Someone's got to be poor if it's a relative measure, less than 60% median income. But then you can decide. In Britain, for example, we've preserved income levels, relatively speaking, for older people and made families with children and working age relatively poorer. I'm sure it's not related to the fact that older people vote Conservative and younger people. I'm sure it's totally unrelated. The government didn't think about that for a moment when they decided to preserve pension levels and make it harder for working age and families with children. But had they thought about it, this might well have been in their interests. And if we look at the amount of money that families spend on basics, food, household heating, you can see that this is from the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, in the richest quintile, 16.4% of money goes on basics, food and energy and so on. And in the poorest quintile, nearly half household income. So if they get a bit poorer, wow, this is a choice between heating and eating. Will we be warm or will we be hungry? And between 2004-5 and 2008-9, with the onset of the economic downturn, things got worse for people on low income. I will talk about that one. This is the percent of the population reporting bad or very bad health by social protection expenditure. The greater a country's expenditure on social protection, the lower the proportion of the population that reports bad health. I sometimes think that when our politicians in Britain at least, say we've got to get social welfare spending down, I'd like a little bird to be whispering in their ear and killing people in the process. It's good to make people sick. That's why we want to reduce welfare spending. It's somehow as if, of course, welfare spending's a bad thing. Of course, any decent person would know welfare spending is a bad thing. Wait a minute, welfare spending is making people healthier. When it's appropriate, it's actually good for the health of the population. And when I talked about the fact that we shouldn't throw older people on the scrap heap, we know that social isolation is bad for health for older people. A review of 147 studies of social isolation and mortality in older people, 147 studies of social isolation and mortality in older people, showed that social isolation was a more potent predictor of mortality than was smoking in people aged 50 plus. Let me just come back to Piketty. Piketty talks about inequalities of wealth, but of course there are big inequalities in income too. What this shows is the share in the US of total household income enjoyed by the top 1%. In 1928, the top 1% had 23% of total household income. The Great Crash went down to under 10%. And then in the late 1970s, early 1980s, it zoomed up again. So by 2007, the top 1% had 23% of total household income. And then there was another crash. Now, thinking about income and wealth, what are the top 1% going to do with all that money? How many houses and yachts can one family consume? What they're going to do, and the figures show, they'll save about 20%. Low income save nothing. High income save for the top 1%, save about 20%, and they'll pass it on to their children. We will be reproducing 19th century patrimonial capitalism with great swathes of inherited wealth. And that's not very good. I mean, if you're a conservative and you believe that people should be rewarded for merit and hard work, then you're being complicit in a system that's rewarding people on the basis of how much money their parents had, not on the basis of their own merit and hard work. So never mind if you're on the right of the spectrum or the left of the political spectrum. The situation that's developing more in the Anglophone economies than in the Nordic economies is vast swathes of inherited wealth, which, again, quoting Piketty, if somehow you can tolerate, if you take a human rights approach and we say we all have an equal right to a healthy, sustainable life, but we can tolerate the inequalities that we see if we think it's based on some defensible principle. But inequalities based on inherited wealth is hardly a defensible principle. It's not rewarding effort, merit, and other things. But that's where we're heading. Let me finish. As you see, I've indulged by skipping over most of my slides. Let me finish by saying two things. One is that we need to be very practical. We need to help people figure out what to do. In England, for example, 3/4 of local authorities have Marmot implementation plans. They have actually taken my English review and tried to develop practical plans. The King's Fund did a survey and asked local government, what are your priorities? And the number one, 49 out of 65, said Marmot principles. In Sweden, as Susanna reported, we've had the Malmö Commission, Östergötland, the Gothenburg activity. We think things will happen in Stockholm. They may happen nationally. It's vital to get practical, say, how are we going to make progress and develop practical plans? But there's something else, and that's having the moral commitment. That's having a view of the kind of society we want to achieve, the kind of society we want to live in, and the kind of society we want for our children. And what we said in the European review, based on what our Swedish colleagues said to us, there's something here for everybody. If you're doing very little, do something, makes a difference. If you're doing more, do more. And if you're Sweden and Norway and Denmark and Iceland and Finland, do it better. Thank you.